In the sunburnt lands of Utah, a blind girl kneels beside a shattered wooden board. No tears on her face, just trembling hands collecting broken pieces. Her beloved horse has just fallen into the canyon, and no one believes. She saw it through a touch of old wood. Not through her eyes, but something deeper memory breath, the gentle sound of hooves rising from the earth. This is not just a story about a horse. It is redemption. A soul released through one final gaze. Tap subscribe now to follow our journey of cinematic storytelling, where each film dives deep into the heart, just like the moment you're about to witness. Utah stretched out like the bones of the earth, bare, unfiltered, merciless. The wind whispered in cracked tongues through the dry brush, carrying no secrets, only the taste of dust and salt. Light fell hard on the land, not gentle, not golden. It poured down like judgment, unforgiving and white. Shadows didn't scatter, they clung to things. The valley below shimmered like it was on fire, though there was no flame, only heat. At the edge of this fierce quiet stood a house, gray wooden, squatting low against the wind, as if afraid it might be noticed by the sky. Its boards were splintered by time, not neglect, and its roof had learned to groan only in whispers, as if remembering something. Inside lived a man who no longer remembered how to speak to joy, and a girl who had never seen it. Bella, 16, born blind, skin pale like fresh linen left in winter wind. She had hair the color of wild sage and eyes that searched the horizon, though they could never see it. Her blindness didn't show in her expression, it was in how still she was when she listened. Like she wasn't waiting to hear sound, but waiting for the silence to move. She moved through the land like someone who had lived there long before she was born. Her steps were careful, but confident, trained, not timid. She didn't need a cane. She didn't need pity. She knew where every nail had rusted, where every plank whispered beneath her heel. The land didn't belong to her, not legally, not technically, but it answered to her presence more than it ever did to fences. Following her step for step was Frost. The horse was old. His gray coat had once been a color closer to storm clouds. Now, it held more bone than thunder. His hooves didn't clack, they sighed. But he moved with a gentleness that had nothing to do with age. It was reverence. Not for the land, but for the girl. He stayed close enough that his breath could brush her wrist if he chose. He never did. She never reached for him. There was no need. Theirs was not a relationship built on instruction or reward. There were no treats, no bridles. They were bound by something harder to name. Frost had been a competition horse once. That legacy had been beaten out of him long ago, traded for miles of loneliness and nights under stars that didn't blink. But with Bella, he remembered stillness. He remembered how to wait. In the barn, Harlan was working a wrench into a tractor that had stopped listening years ago. The tools were heavy and cold, but the silence was heavier. He swore under his breath, a quiet habit, a ritual. Nothing was working, not really. Not the soil, not the debt, not the past. The land he lived on was trying to forget him, and he couldn't blame it. He glanced through the open barn door. Out in the light, he saw her Bella, her hand on the fence post, face turned upward like she was trying to read the sun. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had stopped trying to explain the world to her after the 4th birthday. She didn't need his explanations. His daughter didn't look broken to him. She looked like something the world wasn't ready for. Back on the porch, Bella stood barefoot. The wind lifted her hair behind her like a veil. Her hand, pale and steady, reached out, not groping, not trembling, and touched the outer wall of the house. Old cedar warm with sun dry to the grain. Her fingertips grazed it like it was a face she'd always known. She didn't move for nearly 2 minutes. Frost watched from a few yards away, still as stone. "I wish I could feel what it looks like," she whispered. Her voice barely touched the air. "This light. Everyone says it's blinding out here. But I can't feel it. Not in my eyes. Not the way they mean." Her hand slid over the grooves in the wood. There were patterns there carved by age, shaped by weather, years of wind and pain embedded in cellulose. To Bella, they were not damage. They were texture. They were proof something had endured. She didn't want smooth things. Smooth things had no story. The wind kicked up a moment later, strong enough to lift the corner of the porch mat. Bella turned her face toward it, nostrils flaring. She could smell the change. Dryness giving way to metal, the scent of distant thunder, without the noise. She took a step back, hands still trailing the wall. Inside the house, a radio crackled to life, static, and an old country song warped by distance and a failing circuit board. Harlan cursed again. He smacked the thing off. Silence returned like an old debt. Bella stepped off the porch gravel, crunching beneath her feet. She walked slow, deliberate toward the small pasture where they let Frost graze. Her hands weren't in front of her. She didn't need them to see. The path curved around a low ridge, the grass thin and sallow this time of year. Frost followed behind. No sound from him, just presence. The girl stopped halfway to the paddock. She crouched down, put both hands in the dirt, closed her eyes tighter. She didn't pray. She never prayed. But she listened. Frost nudged her gently on the shoulder. She leaned back against him, a gesture so natural it might have been rehearsed, though it never was. It wasn't affection, not in the human sense. It was contact. Confirmation. She smiled. "You're warm," she said. The horse exhaled. In the distance, a coyote barked once, then again. It didn't sound hungry, just lonesome. Bella stood. Her mouth tightened. "Daddy says light means truth," she said aloud, though only the horse heard. But maybe truth isn't what light shows. Maybe it's what the dark lets you feel. She walked back toward the house. Frost didn't follow this time. He watched her go. At the edge of the porch, Bella stopped again. She ran her fingers along the wooden railing. The grain was rough. A splinter bit her fingertip. She didn't flinch. She pressed harder. "I wonder," she whispered, "if light can leave a bruise." She opened the door without knocking. She never knocked. Inside, Harlan sat at the kitchen table staring at a tax form like it was written in blood. The room smelled like black coffee and resignation. "Dinner in an hour," he muttered. Bella nodded, though she didn't turn her head. Back in her room, the walls were blank. No pictures, no color. Just a bed, a desk, a journal she couldn't see but still wrote in. Her fingers knew the braille by heart. She didn't need to see her own words. She only needed to get them out. Today she wrote, "Frost is slower now, but he stays with me like he's waiting for something. Maybe he thinks I can see what he lost. I wish I could. I wish I could give it back." She paused. The pen hovered. "Sometimes I think the light is afraid of me. Like it knows I won't believe it no matter how loud it shines." She closed the journal, laid it down. Back on the porch, the wind had settled. The sky was the color of worn denim. Frost stood at the edge of the pasture, unmoving, watching the house, watching her. Inside, Bella lay on her bed, hands stretched above her palm open like it was waiting to catch something. She wasn't asleep. She was listening to the house creak, to the breath of wood, to the whisper of wind between the cracks. "I know you're out there," she said softly. "I know there's light somewhere." She lowered her hand, touched her chest, "But I don't need to see it. I just need to know it touches me too." She got up, walked barefoot again onto the porch. She touched the wall. This time her hand didn't move. And for a moment, just a breath of time, her face changed, like she saw something, not with her eyes, with everything else. Then she smiled and whispered, "There you are." The morning didn't announce itself. It just happened, like a breath being held too long, finally escaping. The wind was softer than usual, slow like molasses. Cold gnawed at the barn doors, but didn't bite. Frost usually greeted the day early. He was the first sound Bella would hear. His hooves against frostbitten soil, the quiet huff of his breath. The rhythm of him more heartbeat than horse. But that morning, nothing. Just the silence. Bella sat up in bed the moment her ears failed to catch his approach. The absence was loud, immediate. Her chest tightened, the kind of pressure that made breath feel too expensive to waste. She listened again. Still nothing. She rose. Her bare feet brushed against the wood floor, cold, splintered. The room was still painted in the same shade of silence. No birds, no motion, and most terrifying of all, no frost. She grabbed her coat fingers, fumbling through fabric like they were underwater. The cane stayed leaning against the wall. She didn't take it. It would be too slow. She moved out into the chill. The sun had only just begun to rise, its light bleached and sterile. Her hair whipped in the wind, but she didn't register the cold. Not really. Her face was taut focused. All her senses dialed in to a single truth. He's not here. "Frost," she called, voice sharper than usual. "Frost, where are you?" Her words evaporated into air. No echo, no reply. She made her way toward the pasture boots, crunching half-frozen mud. The gate stood ajar, nudged slightly outward, like it had been pushed not by human hands, but by a body that knew the motion well. Her heart began to pound, not in panic yet, but in that liminal space between knowing and hoping. "Frost." She cupped her hands around her mouth, as if that might carry her voice farther. "Come back." Still nothing. Harlan stepped onto the porch behind her, coffee in hand. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at her as she walked, trailed the fence line, called again and again. When she paused, breath-ragged hands clutching the fence like a lifeline, he finally spoke. "He'll be back," he muttered, her head whipped toward the sound. "You don't understand. It's a horse, Bella, not your guardian angel." She flinched. The sentence hit like sleet, sharp, dispassionate. She shook her head. "He never leaves. He never wanders. Animals wander. That's what they do." Her hands curled into fists. She turned back to the open pasture, the open gate, the open question. She kept moving, her boots sliding in places where frost clung to roots. She didn't stop until the house was no longer behind her, and the wind sounded different. She entered the woods. Bare branches clawed at the sky like accusations. The air was thicker here, less wind, more breath. The crunch beneath her feet was louder now, more personal. Each step a scream. Her fingers ran along the trunks as she walked, seeking moss-texture bark. She didn't need sight to know she was alone. She could feel the lack of him, like an amputated limb. She stopped, tilted her head. "I know you're here," she said into the cold. "I can feel the hole you left." She listened for hoofbeats, a snort, even the telltale sound of disturbed brush. Nothing. Just wind through trees and her own heartbeat galloping in her chest. Her breathing sped. Not panic, something older. Deeper. Like grief was waking up in her belly, shaking off sleep, stretching its arms. "Please," she whispered. "Please come back." She moved in erratic lines, zigzagging through terrain that grew more rugged. She called again and again. Each time her voice sounded more like someone else's. Younger, more desperate. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time twisted in the cold. Her voice finally cracked. The silence answered back, and she fell to her knees. It was as if something had punched her from the inside. She clutched the dirt tears hot on frozen cheeks. A sob escaped her, raw, full-throated. The kind of sound you don't practice, the kind that only shows up when the universe has stolen something that meant more than words. She screamed into the soil, into the silence, into the nothing. Nothing answered. She stayed there, curled into herself, forehead pressed against the earth, long after her throat gave out. It was late afternoon when she returned to the house. Empty. Frostless. She didn't say anything as she walked in, didn't remove her coat. She just went to the wall, the one outside her room that soaked in sun during the day and held on to warmth long after the light had gone. She pressed her hand against it, her fingers splayed, and something happened. It wasn't warmth, not exactly. It was pressure, not physical, something underneath. A tension like someone was standing on the other side. Like something was about to pass through her fingers. Her breath caught in her throat. She closed her eyes tighter. The sensation changed. Texture shifted beneath her skin. Her palm began to tingle, not painful, but electric, like nerves remembering something before she did. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Then the image hit her. Not a vision, not in the traditional sense. There was no color, no light. But it was clear, unmistakably real. Frost, standing at the edge of something. She felt it more than saw it. He was on solid ground, but only just. The air around him was different, thinner. She recognized the sound of falling wind, sharp-edged and violent. The place had a smell coppery like blood and cold metal. A drop. A cliff. She reached for the wall again, breath stuttering. Frost wasn't looking away. He was staring straight at her. The same distance he always stood. And yet, further than ever. His eyes. Oh God, his eyes. She could feel them not just on her face, but behind her ribs. They weren't afraid. They weren't wild. They were tired and sad. A sadness she didn't know horses could feel. A sadness that said, "I didn't mean to go. But I can't come back." The image blinked away. Her knees buckled. She slid down the wall arms, wrapped tight around herself, trying to contain the pressure, the grief, the impossible reality of what she'd just felt. Inside the house, Harlan stood in the hallway, coffee forgotten, staring at her. He didn't speak. She didn't notice him. She was in another place entirely. She whispered over and over, barely audible, "I saw him. I saw him. I saw him." It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was devastation, pure and direct. She saw him, and she knew. He was gone. Not wandered, not strayed. Gone. And she had no proof, no body, no witnesses. Just a feeling burned into her hand and a face she never physically saw staring back from the edge of her soul. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the hallway, back against the wall, palm still pressed flat where the warmth lingered. Frost never came home, but she didn't need him to anymore, because somehow he already had. Right there, between her fingers, and somewhere far away at the edge of the world, a cliff stood still, guarding the silence of that final look. Harlan didn't say a word when Bella told him. Not at first. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a cup of lukewarm tea she hadn't touched. Her voice was calm, eerily so. As if it wasn't grief she was carrying, but certainty. There was no drama in how she spoke, no pleading, just a strange, soft authority. "He's there," she said. "Where?" She turned her face toward him. Not her eyes, her face. Her whole body listened before answering. "East Ridge, past the deer blind, maybe 20 feet from the edge. There's a crack in the earth. It smells like rust." He stared at her. His own cup trembled against the saucer. What the hell are you talking about?" "Frost," she said. "He fell, or jumped. I don't know. But he's there. I saw him." "You saw him," he echoed. "Bella, you're blind." She didn't flinch. "I still saw him." The words hung between them like a nail in a taut wire. He pushed away from the table so hard the chair shrieked against the floor. "I'll go check," he muttered. He grabbed his jacket with more force than necessary, but his hands shook as he did. He didn't meet her face. Didn't want to. She didn't ask to go with him. She only whispered, "Don't lie when you get back." He didn't expect to find anything. Not really. As he stomped through the frozen underbrush, Harlan's mind reeled. Bella had always been sensitive, tuned to the invisible frequency. But this was different. This was impossible. She was grieving, sure. Traumatized. Maybe her mind was giving her pictures she wanted. Or needed. Kids do that. Adults too. The wind picked up. Branches clashed like brittle bones above his head. The sky had a dull metallic gleam, the kind that threatened snow but delivered silence. It was a long walk. Too long. He remembered that Frost had wandered this direction before. But never alone. Never far. And Bella, damn it, how could she know? He crested the ridge just as she'd said. Past the rusted deer blind. And then he saw it. The crack. Sharp. Deep. Earth torn like flesh. And there, 20 feet down, twisted between boulders unmoving. Frost. The gray of his body nearly disappeared against stone, but Harlan knew that shape even from this distance. The angle of the legs. The impossible stillness. No steam. No sound. No life. He fell to his knees, fingers digging into the dirt as if it might rewind time. The world narrowed. Wind ceased. The only thing left was the memory of Bella's voice, the echo of her certainty. He sat there for a long time, unmoving. Not just because of grief, but fear, because she had been right. Down to the direction, the smell, the curve of the cliff. Right. He didn't tell her the truth when he got back. Not at first. He opened the door, hung up his coat. Sat across from her at the table again. She hadn't moved. "Well," she asked. He lied. Quietly. Didn't see anything. She nodded once. Then reached out, placed her palm flat against the wall beside her. Her brow furrowed. "You're lying." His teeth clenched. "Bella, you don't have to protect me." "I'm not." "You're scared." He said nothing. She turned her head slightly. Her hand never left the wood. "I'm not," she said softly. He looked at her like he didn't know her. Maybe he didn't. "Did you dream it?" he asked. "No." "How could you know where?" "I didn't know," she said. "I felt him." "Felt?" "In the wall. Right here." She traced the grain with 2 fingers. Her touch was reverent. Familiar. "He sent it," she said. "That's not... Bella, that's not real." She turned her whole body toward him again. Slowly. Her face was impassive, but her voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "You're saying it because you can't explain it, not because it didn't happen." His jaw worked. "It's not normal." "I'm not normal. I didn't mean it like that." "You did," she said. "And that's okay. You've always wanted me to stay in your world. But maybe I was never supposed to." Silence. Heavy. Real. She stood. "I want to go somewhere," she said. "Tomorrow." Juno arrived the next morning in a green truck that looked like it had survived 3 wars and a drought. She was lean mid-40s, with a face like dried tobacco leaf and eyes that had seen too much. She didn't knock, just walked in like she always had when Frost needed a shot or a checkup. But today, she didn't carry a medical bag, just a look. The kind that says, "I heard. And I believe it more than I want to." Bella sat ready by the door. Jacket zipped, boots on. Calm. Juno crouched beside her. "You sure about this?" she asked. "I need to go back," Bella said. "Back where?" "To where he came from." Harlan watched from the kitchen, his face tight. "She's grieving," he muttered. Juno stood. "We all are. But this thing she thinks she saw. She's not the one I'm worried about," Juno said. They drove in silence. Bella sat in the passenger seat, hand pressed against the dashboard. Juno didn't ask what she was feeling for. The triangle, once a training ground, now abandoned, rose out of the earth like a carcass. The fences leaned. The bleachers sagged. Everything smelled like old sweat and shame. The paint had peeled. The flags were gone. But the ghosts were still there. Juno helped Bella out, guided her through the broken gate. She didn't speak. Bella walked slow, trailing her hand along the splintered wood, same as she did at home. "This place," Bella said. "It has pain." Juno exhaled. "I was here when he came in." Frost. They called him Thor back then. Wanted him to race with the quarter horses. What happened? They broke him. Over and over. With bits, whips, spurs, shouts. Every time he didn't go faster, they said he was stubborn. Every time he stumbled, they blamed his blood. Bella touched a low rail. Her hand trembled. "I hear it," she said. Juno swallowed hard. It wasn't just Frost. This place trained winners, champions. None of them retired whole. Why didn't anyone stop it? Because we called it glory. Back at home, Bella stood again by the same patch of wall. The grain was familiar now, sacred. She pressed her palm flat and saw, not Frost this time, a man, tall, harsh hands, holding the reins too tight. Spit flying from his mouth as he shouted. Pain, a flash of hooves, terror, then nothing. Bella gasped. Juno was beside her watching. "What is it?" "I saw him," Bella whispered. "The man who broke Frost." Juno looked down. There were many. This one. He hated being watched. She pressed harder into the wood. "He's still afraid," she said. Even now. Harlan appeared in the doorway, pale. "This isn't healthy." Juno turned to him. What part of grief ever is? She needs help. She needs the truth. He stepped forward, eyes sharp. She needs to stop pretending she's some kind of prophet. Bella didn't speak. She just reached out and touched his arm. He flinched. She didn't move. "You want me to stop," she said. "Because it's easier to believe I'm broken than to admit something's broken in the world." That was the first time Harlan didn't have an answer. He just left the room. Later that night, Bella sat outside, alone. The sky was smeared in stars, cruel in its clarity. She ran her fingers over the wall again. But nothing came. Not an image, not a pulse, just stillness. She didn't panic. "Frost," she said softly. "If that's all you had to give, I'm grateful." She rested her cheek against the wood. And for the first time since he vanished, she didn't cry. She smiled. Because for a few fleeting moments, something had spoken across the fracture, and she had listened. The days after Frost's body was retrieved from the canyon passed like a fogged window. Too much light outside, but nothing visible through the glass. Bella didn't cry. Not in the way people expected. No gasps, no wails. But something inside her had broken in precise, quiet lines. And through each fracture, something new had begun to slip in. Memory, but not her own. Each night she returned to the same place on the wall, same spot, same angle of hand, and waited. The first time the image had rushed at her. But now it came in fragments. Like smoke curling around thought. Like scent remembered before shape. The first was a hand, thick fingers gripping a whip tight practiced. The leather frayed at the edges. This wasn't a tool. It was a weapon made familiar through repetition. She could feel the tension in the hand, the rhythm of cruelty so normalized it no longer registered as wrong to the one holding it. Then a sound, not a voice, a scream, hoarse, equine, desperate, followed by the thunder of hooves slamming against hard ground. Panic. She felt it like a cord snapping inside her chest. She recoiled, hand dropping from the wall. Juno was sitting a few feet away, notebook in lap, watching silently. She didn't ask what Bella saw. Bella's breath caught. He was afraid. Juno nodded slowly. "Frost?" "No," Bella said. "The man. The one with the whip." He was afraid too, of being seen. Silence passed between them. Bella reached again, this time slower. And there it was, again more pieces. A metal gate clanging shut, a horse's flanks shuddering under a lash, men laughing. Another scream. And then, eyes. Frost's eyes wide wild, but not defiant. Pleading. Bella's own heartbeat slowed in response, not out of calm, but gravity. She understood in some animal part of her soul what those eyes were saying. "Help me. See me. Don't let me be remembered like this." When she pulled her hand away again, she was trembling. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "You don't have to," Juno said. "You're a child, Bella." Bella turned to her, and for a moment her face looked older than it should have. "No, I'm not," she said. "Not anymore." Later that week, Juno brought her an article. An old photo buried deep in the archives of a rodeo newsletter. The man in it was younger then, but the grip on the reins was unmistakable. Daniel Cortez, champion rider, winner of the regional finals 5 years prior. Quiet retirement, no scandal, no questions. He'd faded from public memory like a bad tune after a good night. But Frost had remembered. Juno didn't say much when she handed Bella the page. She simply said, "He lives 3 towns over. Hasn't touched a saddle in years." Bella folded the paper once then again. "I want to go." The house was small. set back from the main road, hunched behind a grove of cottonwoods that hadn't bloomed right in years. The porch sagged under the weight of past conversations, never had. Daniel answered the door like a man expecting the past to show up eventually. He looked older than in the photo, but not broken, just hollowed out. His eyes scanned Juno, first recognition flickering. Then Bella. "I don't do interviews," he said quietly. Bella didn't flinch. "I'm not a journalist." Daniel hesitated. "Then what do you want?" "I need to say something." He stepped back slowly, opened the door. Inside, the house smelled like cedar and guilt. There were no trophies, no pictures, just a chair, a bottle, and silence. They sat in the living room. Juno declined the drink. Bella didn't speak until the hush in the air had grown heavy enough to bend. "You remember Frost?" she said. Daniel stiffened. "I remember a lot of horses," he said. Bella didn't raise her voice. "He remembers you." Daniel looked away. Bella stood, walked toward the wooden mantel. Her hand reached out, rested flat against it. Her breathing slowed. Then came the vision. Daniel screaming. Boots slamming against dirt. Frost flinching, trying to back away. The rein pulled tighter. The whip descending. Again. Again. Bella flinched. He was afraid, she said, eyes still closed. "But he didn't hate you. He just wanted it to stop." Daniel's voice cracked. "It was the only way to make them listen." "Who?" "The owners, the scouts, the crowds. Nobody cares how you win, only that you do." He stood abruptly crossed to the window. "You think I don't know what I did? You think I don't hear that scream every time I close my goddamn eyes?" Juno watched from the doorway. Silent, tense. Bella stepped forward. "I didn't come here to punish you," she said. Frost already carried that. It broke him. But he didn't want to carry your shame too. Daniel turned, eyes rimmed red. "Then why are you here?" She reached out, and for the first time touched his hand. His breath caught. She felt it the way one feels wind through a cave hollow, echoing full of things unsaid. Because she said softly, he didn't want the last one who looked at him to be the one who hurt him. Daniel stared at her, mouth open, but no words came. Bella didn't need them. Outside, the trees groaned in the wind. Leaves danced without rhythm. As they walked back to the truck, Bella said nothing. Juno finally asked, "Was that for him or for you?" Bella turned her face into the wind. It was for Frost. That night she sat again by the wall. But something had changed. The images didn't come like they had before. Only one remained, not of the past, but of the present. Frost standing in a field that didn't exist anywhere in Utah. Lush, boundless. No rains, no fear, no noise. Just peace. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking away, finally, toward something only he could see. But his ears twitched, just once, acknowledging her. Then he walked, not to escape, but to rest. Bella's tears came finally. Quiet, clean, no sobbing. Just the sound of memory being laid down like soft earth over a grave. Juno found her hours later, asleep beside the wall. One hand still pressed to the wood. She didn't wake her, because some goodbyes weren't meant to be interrupted. And some forgiveness only needed to be felt once. Harlan saw the wall before he saw her. The wood had become something else, a shrine, a wound, a portal. Bella sat beside it every day, now, her hand pressed flat, her lips moving in silence. She didn't need help to find it anymore. The grain in the timber knew her fingers like water knows stone, and Harlan hated it. He didn't say so aloud. Not at first. But it crept into everything, his gait, his voice, the silence he wielded like a knife at dinner. The kind of silence that wasn't passive, but violent. Bella felt it before he opened his mouth. "You have to stop," he said one morning, his voice too calm. She didn't turn her head. "Stop what?" "This game, this obsession." She didn't answer, just breathed. The same way she always did when he didn't want to hear the truth. He stepped closer. "It's not real," he snapped. "You're clinging to ghosts." Bella finally turned her face toward him. "That's what you're afraid of, isn't it? That something I can't see is more real than you." He froze. Something snapped not in her, but in him. Without a word, he turned and stormed out the back door. The screen banged shut behind him. Bella didn't follow. The first hammer blow came mid-morning. The second followed 2 seconds later, louder, angrier. Bella flinched at the sound. It wasn't the volume, it was the intention. She stepped barefoot onto the porch. The air was dry and sharp. She didn't need to see what was happening to know it. The barn, more specifically the stall, Frost's stall. Harlan's silhouette was a blur of rage, arms swinging boards, cracking old nails, shrieking as they were torn from the frame. Bella walked slowly toward it, each step measured like a prayer. "Stop," she said, not shouting. He didn't hear her, or didn't want to. "I said stop." Another board crashed to the ground. She stepped closer now, just yards from him. "You're destroying him," she said. "What's left of him?" Harlan wheeled on her, wild-eyed. "No," he bellowed. "I'm destroying this lie you've built. This madness." You talk to walls. You hear dead horses. You act like you know something the rest of us don't. I do, she said. Because I listen. He stared at her. Then listen to this, he growled, grabbing another plank of sun-bleached cedar. It's just wood. He slammed it down against the floor. The sound was sickening. Bella fell to her knees beside the scattered shards. She didn't scream. She didn't wail. She just wept, silently, racking, bone deep. She reached out, hands trembling, trying to gather the splinters as if they were pieces of Frost himself. Her fingertips bled on the edges. She didn't care. Her breath hitched in jagged waves, but her face stayed still. Her grief had no room for theatrics. It was real, dense, heavy as earth. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Harlan's chest heaved. Because I can't watch you disappear into something that's not there. She looked up at him then. I'm not the one disappearing. That's when Juno arrived. She didn't knock. She never did. She walked straight into the barn and stood between father and daughter like a dam holding back floodwater. What the hell are you doing, Harlan? He didn't answer. Juno stared at the wreckage, then at Bella on the ground. Then calmly, but with fire in her voice, she said, She's not the blind one. You are. The sentence cut the air in half. Harlan blinked. She sees more in a piece of timber than you've ever seen in your own child. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Bella, then away. I didn't want to lose her too, he muttered. Juno's expression softened, but only slightly. Then stop trying to erase the parts of her you don't understand. Bella stood slowly, clutching the largest remaining plank to her chest. It was split, jagged, but hers. That night the house was quiet, not silent. Quiet in the way trees quiet after a storm broken, but not dead. Bella didn't sleep. She sat in her room with the piece of wood on her lap, fingers tracing every scar, every groove. Nothing came through, no visions, no sounds, but she didn't need them. She just needed to hold on. The next morning, a truck pulled into the drive. Dust trailed it like a tale of regret. Daniel stepped out. He looked smaller in daylight, older, sober. He didn't wait to be greeted. He walked straight to the barn. Bella met him there, hands still coated in dry blood and splinters. I came to help, he said. She tilted her head. Why? Because I think I'm still the last one he saw. She nodded. Daniel knelt beside her, picked up a board. He didn't flinch at the nails. Together they began rebuilding. Not the whole stall, just the fence, the last stretch of railing that overlooked the ridge. The place Frost had always stood at sunset. Bella guided his hands. He followed her instructions without question. They worked in silence. No music, no words, only the sound of wood meeting wood, the occasional screech of a hammer, and the wind just enough to remind them they were still on Earth. Juno watched from the porch arms, crossed eyes burning. Even Harlan came out eventually. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave. When the last nail was driven in, Daniel stepped back. Bella ran her hand along the length of it, then placed her palm flat in the center and breathed. The wind shifted, soft, gentle, and for the first time since Frost died, she smiled, not because she saw him, but because she didn't have to anymore. There were no more visions, not since the fence, not since the last nail had been driven and Bella had placed her hand one final time on the restored wood. What had once been lightning in her veins, what had once come with flashes of pain and memory and voices not her own, was now stillness. She touched the planks each night as she always had, but the wood no longer spoke. There were no pictures, no feelings transmitted across the grains, just warmth, just presence. At first, she feared it was over, that the bridge had closed and Frost was truly gone now, that the silence left behind was something final, something cruel. But then the fear faded, because the stillness wasn't empty. It was full, of peace, of something finished, of something forgiven. She understood now she didn't need the visions to believe. She had been chasing proof, but belief had never required proof. It required presence, connection, trust. And now she trusted what she couldn't see. Harlan had changed too, but not like lightning changes the sky. More like how winter slowly lifts from the edges of the earth unnoticed until the first blades of green make themselves known. He started sitting with her in the evenings. At first he didn't say a word. He brought his coffee, settled into the rickety porch chair, and stared into the same dark she did. She never turned toward him. She just kept her hand on the wall. Night after night, the ritual repeated. Until one night, without warning, he broke the silence. You were right, he said. She didn't respond. I didn't want to believe. Not just in Frost, or you, or whatever the hell was happening. I didn't want to believe that something beautiful could still live in this place. Still, she said nothing. Not because she was punishing him, but because some truths don't need acknowledgement. They just need air. He continued, You know I used to think you were weak. That your quiet meant you didn't understand. That not seeing the world meant you didn't belong in it. He paused. I was wrong. Bella's hand slowly slid from the wood and rested on her lap. I see more now, he whispered. Not through my eyes. Through yours. That was the first time she reached out to him. Her hand found his resting rough and calloused on the armrest. She didn't grip. She didn't squeeze. She just touched it. And in that single act, the war between them ended. Not with victory, but with surrender. Word of frost had begun to ripple beyond the house. It wasn't Bella who spread it. It was Daniel. He had stayed in town longer than anyone expected. Perhaps longer than he expected himself to. Every morning he returned to the barn, to the fence, to the ghosts that once defined him. And he built something. Not alone. Others began to show up. A local vet, a stable worker, a former rider with a crooked spine and a broken temper. They carried with them names, some spoken, some written. Horses that had run too hard, jumped too high, fallen too fast. They brought photographs, grainy old yellowed at the corners. They brought guilt, but also remembrance. Daniel nailed each one to a long slab of pine cut from the same wood that once lined the inside of Frost's stall. They shaped the timber into a wide board, mounted it near the ridge where Bella had first felt the fall. And on it, burned deep into the grain, were the words she had spoken weeks before. The last gaze is for the one who loved. When she was brought to the site, she reached out, placed her hand on the phrase, and whispered, "He knows." No one asked what she meant. They didn't have to. Because there, for the first time, was a place that told the truth. A truth not about glory, but cost. About the animals who bore the weight of human ambition and the people who spent their lives pretending not to hear the breaking beneath them. Now the breaking had been named, and that somehow began the mending. The community didn't react all at once. Some avoided the memorial. Some said nothing. But others came, and when they did, they brought stories. A woman in her 70s remembered a chestnut mare with cracked hooves and eyes too old for her age. A man who had trained colts for decades admitted that sometimes the training was just learned cruelty handed down like inheritance. A boy who'd never ridden in his life wept over the photo of a horse he'd only read about. They came not to confess, but to acknowledge, to say this happened. And we let it. And slowly, a kind of healing began, not one that erased the past, but one that allowed the future to walk in without shame. That night, Harlan brought out a blanket and wrapped it around Bella's shoulders as they sat on the porch. "You were always more than I could handle," he said, a rueful smile in his voice. "Because I didn't see the way you did," she asked. "No," he said, "because you saw what I never could." He leaned back in the chair, exhaled. "You taught me how to look. Without eyes. Without answers." She leaned her head against the frame of the door. "I only listened," she said. He nodded. "Maybe that's the hardest kind of seeing." They sat there until the moon rose high, and in the distance, the wind whispered through the trees in a voice that no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like permission to let go, to move on, to remember, not ache. The following Sunday, Daniel hosted the first public gathering at the new memorial. He didn't advertise it, didn't ask for cameras. There were no speeches, just folding chairs, a few guitars, and a quiet circle of people who carried invisible wounds. Bella was led to the front where the wooden slab stood tall, its letters scorched into permanence. She ran her fingers along each word, and then, without a prompt, without ceremony, she began to speak, soft, barely above a whisper. "Not everything that leaves us is gone," she said. "Some things remain, in the way wood remembers touch, in the way silence can still carry voices, in the way we forgive without needing to be told how." No one clapped. They didn't need to. Some closed their eyes, some wept, and one man, bent-backed and gravel-voiced, placed his hand beside hers on the wood. "I was the one who rode Glory," he said. "I broke her knees in a jump she wasn't ready for, then blamed her when she couldn't rise." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Bella turned slightly, and in that moment something passed between them. Not absolution, not understanding, just presence. And presence, she had learned, was enough. When she returned home that night, she didn't go to the wall. She didn't need to. She stepped out into the yard, onto the soft soil still warming from the day's sun. She took off her shoes, let the earth touch her. The wind picked up, then stilled. She closed her eyes and smiled, because in the quiet she heard nothing, and yet felt everything. And for the first time since frost had fallen, the world felt whole again. The rain started like a warning, not thunder, not wind. Just a hush thicker than silence, heavier than sound. It pressed itself against the windows, whispered through the eaves, soaked into the wooden bones of the house, as if trying to find something buried deep inside. Bella didn't wake when it began. She had already fallen beneath it. Her breath had grown shallow earlier that day. A tremor in her hands, a sudden weakness in her steps. She brushed it off at first, said the air felt heavier than usual, blamed the humidity, the summer shifting toward its end. But by dusk, her skin had burned. By nightfall, she could no longer stand. Harlan found her collapsed on the floor near the back door, her hand resting limp against the frame of the wall. He carried her to bed with arms that had once lifted beams and saddles and fence posts. But tonight, they trembled like the limbs of a young man. He didn't call for a doctor. He didn't shout. He just sat, Outside, the storm gathered speed. Inside, Bella slipped into fevered dreams. The room dimmed. The lamplight flickered, caught in a dance with the wind. Harlan sat in the old chair beside her bed, his elbows on his knees, hands clenched, eyes fixed on her face. He hadn't prayed in 20 years, not even when his wife died. Not even when the farm nearly folded, or when Bella was born, with eyes that would never open to the world. But tonight something cracked. Maybe it was the way her lips moved in sleep, whispering to something he couldn't hear. Maybe it was the way her fingers twitched toward the wall, even in unconsciousness. Or maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in his life, he felt completely, utterly helpless. She shivered beneath the covers. He tucked them tighter. "Come back," he murmured. "Just come back." Inside her fevered mind, Bella was not in bed. She was outside. The rain fell around her, but didn't touch her. She could hear it, 1,000 soft drum beats against a roof she couldn't see. The air was thick with wet earth and something else. Something alive. She turned. There he was. Frost. But not as he'd looked in pain or fear. He stood beneath a tree she didn't recognize in a field she'd never walked. His coat shimmered, not white, not gray, but something in between. The color of cloud edges in moonlight. His eyes met hers, and this time she didn't feel sorrow, or fear, or warning. She felt peace. The kind of peace you don't earn, but are gifted. Frost stepped forward. She felt the soft tremble of the earth beneath each hoofbeat, like distant thunder, whispering reassurance. And then she heard it. Not words, not images, but emotion, like a breath across the soul. Relief, release, forgiveness. He was showing her how he felt, not about the pain, or the fall, or the years lost, but about now. This moment. This return. He was free, and he wanted her to be too. She reached out, not with fear, not with desperation, but with trust. Her fingers touched the space between them. And for one perfect instant, there was no blindness, no death, no sorrow, just connection, like light had found a new way to enter the world. Back in the room, Bella stirred. Her hand rose, slowly trembling with fever, and moved toward the wall beside the bed. Her palm flattened against the wood as if pulled by memory. Harlan watched. He didn't speak, didn't move. Something in the air shifted. He reached forward. His hand, calloused and uncertain, rested gently atop hers. A spark. Not a literal one, but something real. A sensation, a knowing. He couldn't explain it later, not to Juno, not to himself. But in that moment, with her hand beneath his, something passed through him, a sensation he'd forgotten. Wonder, the same kind of awe he felt when he first held Bella as a newborn, fragile and small, but infinite in some unspeakable way. His breath caught in his chest. He didn't see a vision, but he felt something move in him. Like a locked door creaked open just enough to let in the sound of hooves on wet ground. His tears came without warning. He bent forward, pressing his forehead to the edge of the bed, his hand still covering hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything I didn't see." And then softly Bella spoke. "I saw him." Harlan lifted his head. Her eyes were closed, her lips pale, her breath shallow, but her voice was clear. "He's not hurting anymore." Harlan's throat closed. She turned her face toward him. "And I'm not either." The storm passed by dawn. The sun rose hesitant, as if unsure whether it was welcome. But the house held it. Bella slept. Truly slept for the first time in days. Harlan stayed beside her, hand in hers, head leaning against the wall. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he needed answers. He just needed the truth he could feel in his bones now, that love once real never left. It changed form. It moved through wood and time and silence. And in its truest shape, it returned. Not as memory, but as presence. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does not in towns like this. Utah towns aren't built for sudden transformation. They're slow, stubborn places, where history sits heavy in soil and silence is passed down like furniture. But something had shifted, first in whispers, then in motion. What began with one girl and a horse grew roots, not because it was loud, but because it was true. It started with a letter, a simple typed-up note posted on the bulletin board outside the feed store. No logos, no names, just a question. What do our animals remember that we choose to forget? Juno had written it. She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. Those who'd heard Bella's story, who'd stood at the edge of the ridge and read the words, burned into wood. The last gaze is for the one who loved, they already knew. And those who hadn't? They were beginning to ask. At first it was just a few folks, young ranch hands, older horsewomen, one retired vet tech who couldn't forget the look in a gelding's eyes the night before it was put down after a failed race. Then came the offers. "I got time on Saturdays. I've got spare halters. I don't know much, but I'm willing to learn." Juno took the momentum like kindling and built a flame. She found a small property east of town, a worn-down stable surrounded by thistle and bad memory. A place once used to break animals, now reclaimed to heal them. She named it The Last Gaze, not as a warning, but as a promise. Here no creature's final look would be toward fear, only love. The first horses arrived within a month. 3, then 6. All rescued from neglect, abandonment, or the slow withering of being forgotten. They came hollow, angry, brittle. Juno didn't rush them. Neither did Bella. She visited twice a week now. Not to lead or heal, but to listen. She didn't need her visions anymore. She had learned another language, one of breath, stillness, presence. She would sit in the stalls for hours. No touching, no whispering, just being. And the horses responded. They began to lie down beside her. That was the first sign they trusted her more than any sighted person who had ever tried to ride them. Meanwhile, Harlan changed the land. He stood in the back pasture one morning, coffee cooling in his hand, fog curling around his boots, and made the decision. The trees beyond the pasture lined the patch of wild behind the ravine, the forgotten space where nothing grew quite right anymore. That would be it. A resting place. He didn't call it a cemetery, didn't call it sacred, but the paperwork went through. The deed changed. The land was set aside. No horses would be buried alone again. No one would forget their names. He carved the first markers himself. Rough slabs of pine. Frost's name went on the first one, not with a date, but with a phrase. Bella whispered to him one night. He didn't carry people. He carried memory. Harlan burned it in by hand. The second plaque went to Glory. Then came 5 more. And then others began to ask neighbors, friends, even strangers. I lost one too. Would it be okay if... He always said yes. Grief had broken him once. Now it was rebuilding him, one hoofprint at a time. Daniel had changed too, but from the inside out. He didn't return to racing, didn't touch a saddle. Instead, he learned how to kneel again. At Juno's request, he began working with the children. Kids with cerebral palsy, autism, mutism. Some who'd been abused. Some who'd never spoken a full sentence. And the horses, they didn't care. Daniel led sessions barefoot in silence, in slow arcs across the field. No reins, no bridles, just children and breath and space. One girl, age 9, placed her palm on a horse's flank and burst into tears. She hadn't cried in 3 years, not since the accident that had taken her voice. Another boy, unable to maintain eye contact with people, spent hours brushing a horse named Willow without needing to speak. Daniel didn't call it therapy. He called it returning. Kids don't need to be fixed, he told Juno. Neither do the horses. They just need a place where no one asks them to be more than they are. He built a circle in the far paddock stones, placed one by one a labyrinth of sorts. Not for walking, but for waiting. He called it the listening ring. Every child was invited in. None were forced. Most entered in silence and left lighter. Bella watched all of this unfold, not as a leader, not as a prophet, but as a witness. And maybe that was her greatest power. Not to change the world by force, but to help people notice what had already begun. She had stopped needing to be the center of it. She was just part of the circle now, a point on the line. But when people spoke of the change, they spoke of her. Not as a girl who heard ghosts, but as someone who heard what others had stopped listening for. One afternoon, she sat beside Juno in the old barn at the last gaze. The smell of hay, sweat, and wood filled the space. You started this, Juno said quietly. No, Bella answered. Frost did. Juno smiled. Maybe, but you listened. Bella tilted her head. I think he wanted all of us to listen. To him, to ourselves. Juno looked away, eyes misting. Then she said something Bella would never forget. You didn't just help us hear the horses again, Bella. You helped us hear our own guilt, and not run from it. The dedication ceremony was small. They didn't advertise it, but word traveled. Dozens gathered, farmers, riders, children, caretakers. No podiums, no speeches, just a shared stillness. Bella stood beneath the tree-lined hand, resting on the same slab of wood that had once been Frost's stall. It had been cleaned, carved, sealed. And now it bore a new message. Here lies what could not be spoken. Here lives what will never be forgotten. Harlan stood beside her, Daniel across from her, Juno just behind. The wind moved through them, not to chill, but to bless. A boy approached a child no older than 8. His hand gripped a photo. It was a pony, old and thin, but with eyes that still held kindness. Her name was Daisy, he said. Bella crouched, held out her hand. He placed the photo in her palm. She touched it gently, then turned to Harlan. He took it and nailed it to the cedar wall, beside Frost, beside Glory, beside the others. Names that would not fade. Not anymore. Not here. Not again. The wind came from the east that afternoon, strange and warm, like breath exhaled from a memory too long sealed. It moved through the grass with purpose. It whispered through pine needles and old wire fences, circled porch beams like fingers tracing forgotten corners. It didn't howl or rage, it beckoned. Bella sat in her room with the small wooden box her mother had left behind. She'd never opened it before. It had sat on her shelf like a soft-spoken guest, quiet, patient, waiting. She opened the lid with hands steadier than they'd ever been. Inside, a folded letter yellowed with time, but neat as though her mother had placed it there only days before. Bella unfolded it slowly. The paper crackled like dry leaves. She ran her fingers over the lines, each word embossed in her memory, by the way her mother had once whispered them at bedtime. And now in silence she read them again, not with eyes, but with touch, breath, and something deeper. My Bella, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to hold your hand. But you never really needed me to see. You've always known your way through the dark. I know the world will try to make you believe you're missing something, that you're in shadow. But don't let them take that from you. The world is full of eyes, but so few truly see. Don't be afraid of the dark, my girl, because you are the light. Bella exhaled, slowly. The wind tapped against the glass, like it was listening. She didn't cry. The letter didn't break her. It returned something to her. Something she hadn't realized had gone quiet. The voice of the woman who had never once doubted her ability to see the unseen. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, then pressed the lid closed with reverence. Later on the porch, Harlan sat beside her. The air was heavy with the scent of distant rain. The trees bent in rhythm. Bella reached into her coat pocket and handed him the letter. Wordless, he took it with fingers unsure whether they were welcome. He read in silence. When he finished, he didn't look at her, just stared at the horizon. I never knew she wrote this. She knew you wouldn't look for it, Bella said. His jaw tightened. She always said I looked backward too much. That I couldn't let go of things once they were broken. Bella tilted her face toward him. But she also knew I would. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the clouds, rolling westward. I need to tell you something. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. He cleared his throat. I was the one who sold Frost. Her breath caught, but not from surprise. Somewhere deep, she had always known. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to hate me, he said. We were drowning. Debt. Taxes. I told myself he'd go to a good place, that he was just a horse. That it was better than losing the farm. His voice cracked, but I knew. I knew what those places do. I saw the bruises on his legs when he came back. I saw the light gone from his eyes. And still, I said nothing. Bella turned to him then, slow, quiet. I know, she whispered. He finally met her face. And you don't hate me. She reached out, placed her hand gently against his cheek. Warm, steady, the kind of touch that doesn't ask for penance, only presence. No, she said, because I didn't need you to see him again. I needed you to see me, and he did. In that moment, he saw her fully for the first time, not as someone to protect or carry or shelter, but someone to follow. The days that followed were slow, golden, touched by a softness that came not from peace, but from having earned it. The old woods behind the barn, once tangled with thorns, and silence had been cleared, not for crops, not for pasture, but for memory. They built a path through the trees marked by posts of old stall wood, each carved with a name, horses that had been buried, remembered, honored. No grandeur, no polished plaques. Just timber stained by sun, carved by hand, planted in dirt with intention. The posts stood like sentinels, and at the center of the path, at the crossroads of 4 winding trails, stood the first and tallest. It was made of the plank Bella had saved the day Harlan tore down Frost's stall. Once split, now whole. The grain was still rough, still marked by time, but on it etched deep read a phrase in both ink and memory. This wood remembers. Not a command, a statement, a truth, because in that forest, every step was guided by what had once been broken and rebuilt. The memorial became more than a graveyard. It became a map, not just for horses or their stories, but for people. The lost, the silent, the children who couldn't speak, the adults who never learned how. They came not with cameras or plans, but with hands, with time, with names they'd never spoken aloud. And in the quiet they carved them into cedar pine ash. The trees listened, and the wind carried it all forward. Bella stood one afternoon beneath the largest post, her hand resting against its bark-worn face. Behind her, a class of children walked the trail. Some held sticks, others held nothing but breath. One child reached the base of the post, crouched down, and whispered something to the dirt. Bella smiled. "Do you want to know what he said?" she asked Harlan, who now walked beside her with slower but lighter steps. "What?" He told her the horse could still hear her, even underground. Harlan looked at the child, then at Bella. "You think he's right?" Bella's smile didn't waver. "I think love never forgets where it was buried." He nodded, pulling his hat lower against the sun. "Your mother would have liked this place. She made it possible," Bella said. Then after a beat, "And so did you." He looked at her, then his eyes tired, weathered, but unflinchingly clear. "You sure about that?" She reached down, picked up a fallen pine cone, handed it to him. "It doesn't grow from nowhere," she said. "Something has to let go of it first." He held the cone in his palm, stared at it as if it were heavier than it looked. Then he slipped it into his coat pocket. They stood together in the clearing father-daughter windwood, and somewhere just beyond hearing came the faintest sound. Hooves, not racing, just walking, soft, present, enough. The bus door creaked open with a soft hiss, letting in the morning air, a blend of sagebrush wood smoke and the barely there sweetness of hay. Bella stood at the foot of the gravel path, leading to the last gaze, waiting as the children descended one by one, hands outstretched, shoulders, tentative voices, low. They were quiet, not because they were told to be, but because the air told them. The wind here didn't speak in gusts. It breathed. It rustled softly through the slats of the barn, kissed the edges of the wooden memorials like a hand trailing across piano keys. The place didn't welcome with noise, it welcomed with permission. Juno watched from the porch, arms folded, smile hidden behind concentration. She'd brought groups before, but this one was different. These children were like Bella, born blind, or made that way by accident, illness, fate. Some walked with canes, some held hands, and some moved like ghosts, aware of everything, but noticed by none. Bella moved among them without speaking. She didn't explain, didn't lecture. Her instructions came in touches, in the placement of her hand on a shoulder, the gentle guiding of a wrist. One by one, she led them to the long wooden fence, carved with names. This fence wasn't about separation. It was memory and timber. Each board was different, some old, some new. Some smooth as river stones, others still bearing the bark of their past. The names carved into them weren't in Braille, but the children didn't need that. Bella brought the first boy forward. His name was Elias, 7 years old, quiet. When spoken to, he blinked slowly, like language took time to trust. She took his hand and pressed it to the wood. He stood still, very still. His fingers moved along the grain. He tilted his head. And then he whispered, not to anyone in particular, "I hear water." Juno turned slightly. Her breath caught. "Like a river?" she asked gently. "No," Elias said. "Not water moving, just falling. Like when the rain hits a tree and slides down." He paused. "And I hear hooves, but they're not loud. They're soft, like they're trying not to wake anything." Bella's face didn't change, but her hand curled slightly at her side. It was exactly how she had started. Not with visions, but with sensation. Elias turned his face toward her. "Is that what this is?" he asked. "Can wood hold sound?" She nodded. "Yes, if it remembers." He smiled, small, lopsided, radiant. Behind him, the other children lined up without instruction. Something in the moment had tethered them, one by one, to the possibility of what might be waiting behind stillness. One by one, Bella guided them forward. Not a tour, a communion. Juno watched with her heart in her throat. She hadn't seen Bella like this before, not leading, not instructing, but simply transmitting. She moved through the space like someone who had become part of it. Not a guide, not a fixture, a frequency. When the last child reached the wall, Bella stepped back. The children stood in a half circle, all facing the wood. Some with hands on it, some just near. The wind passed through again, and something happened. They breathed together, not in sync, but in agreement, as if their bodies understood something their minds hadn't yet caught up to. A boy near the end of the line turned toward Juno. "I feel warm here," he said. "Where?" she asked. He placed his hand over his chest. "Here." Juno felt her eyes sting. Then she said, "Frost is still speaking, you know. We just have to be very quiet to hear him." Another girl asked, "Who's Frost?" Bella finally turned. "He was the first horse who ever taught me how to see." "But you're blind," the girl said. "Yes," Bella answered. "But I wasn't blind to him." The children didn't ask anything more. They didn't need to. They returned to the barn in a slow procession. No one told them to form a line. No one told them to hush. They simply moved with the rhythm of the place. At the doorway, Juno stepped beside Bella. She didn't finish the sentence. Bella didn't help her. Some moments are better left incomplete. That afternoon, Harlan arrived with a new slab of wood. He had sanded it himself, etched it with names provided by the local shelter names of horses no one had claimed, but who deserved a place on the fence. He didn't speak as he walked it to the field. Daniel was there too. He nodded at Harlan, took one end. Together they lifted the slab into place. Bella watched from a distance the children behind her in a scatter of postures, some sitting cross-legged, others tracing paths in the dirt. Elias stood at her side. He whispered, "It's like the ground is humming." She smiled. "It is." "Why?" "Because something important is happening." He turned his face upward. "Do you think horses become stars?" She thought for a moment. "I think they become echoes." He frowned. "Is that sad?" "No," she said. "It means they keep moving, just not in the way we expect." Juno stepped closer. "Are they ready?" Bella nodded. Juno turned to the group. "Do you want to give this one a name?" A murmur of voices, a few soft suggestions. Then Elias said, "Rain." Everyone stopped. "Why that name?" Juno asked. "Because it feels like something falling." Gently, he said. The children nodded. And so the new slab was marked, Rain, known by feeling, remembered in silence. That evening, Bella stood alone at the fence. The sun dipped behind the ridge in a hush of pink and amber. She placed both hands on the wood fingers, open palms, relaxed. She didn't expect anything. She didn't wait for visions. She just wanted to feel. The air cooled, A breeze lifted her hair. Then barely faintly she felt the vibration. Not a voice, not even a sound. Just a rhythm. Hoofbeats. Soft. Present. Not approaching. Not retreating. Just existing. Somewhere between memory and hope. She smiled and whispered, "I hear you." The evening waited longer than usual to fall. It held itself on the edge of the sky like a breath held between phrases. The kind of pause that doesn't ask for attention, but earns it nonetheless. Light slanted in from the west, bleeding gold across the field, turning everything it touched into memory. Bella sat alone at the memorial. The children had gone. Juno had gone. Even Harlan had returned to the porch quietly, respectfully, as if the air around Bella had made her a cathedral. She didn't need company tonight. Not for this. Her hand moved slowly across the wood frost's original slab, the one that had survived splinters and fire and grief. The grooves had smoothed slightly under years of touch. They were no longer wounds. They were stories. She placed her palm against it, as she had so many times before, and felt nothing. No hum, no image, no pulse. Just wood, just silence. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled. Soft, real, nothing, she whispered. And that's okay. She closed her eyes, let the quiet wrap around her. Then she said, "I still feel your hooves on the ground." A pause, her voice softer now, very gentle. She stayed there, hand resting the breeze, combing her hair across her cheek like a lullaby. The air was warm. Not the heat of the sun, but something older. Something earned. Peace, not the kind that arrives when questions are answered, but the kind that comes when answers are no longer needed. She let her fingers trail off the edge of the plank down to the dirt. Her fingertips pressed into the soil. It was cool, living, familiar. She remembered the first time she had reached for Frost, how he'd stepped toward her without fear, how his breath had mingled with hers, like they shared a single, invisible world. Now that world had grown bigger, because it included silence, because it included others, because it no longer had to include him to be about him. Behind her, the wind stirred the long grass. It moved like something remembering its way home. A hawk cried in the distance, then faded. Somewhere wood creaked, and in the quiet, hoofbeats, soft, measured, unrushed. They weren't loud. They weren't near, but they were there. Bella didn't turn. Didn't need to. She just smiled deeper. The hoofbeats didn't come closer. They passed by. Somewhere to her left, then behind, as if circling, as if checking one last time, as if making sure. And then they faded. Not abruptly, gently, like a breath exhaled through soil. She sat for a long time after, not thinking, not praying, not waiting, just being. And slowly the sound that replaced the hoofbeats wasn't another animal. It was a heartbeat, her own. It pulsed gently in her ears, echoed through her fingertips, throbbed in the soles of her feet, still pressed to the earth. She realized something then. All this time she had thought the sound of hooves had been Frost's final gift. But maybe, just maybe, it had always been hers. A reminder that she was still here, that she still moved, that she still carried what mattered not in memory, but in the rhythm of living. She pressed her hand again to the wood. Still no image, still no hum, but warmth, texture, and something almost imperceptible. The grain of the wood aligned with the grain of her skin, as if they had been carved from the same story. The sun dipped lower now, catching on the edge of the ridge. The gold bled into amber, then into something redder, deeper, like the last note of a cello held just a second longer than expected. The memorial stood tall behind her, surrounded by dozens of slabs, now each one a name, a moment, a memory. Some held flowers, others held tokens, a halter, a photo, a ribbon faded nearly white. But all of them held something else. Presence. Not the ghostly kind, the real kind, the kind that doesn't vanish when you blink or look away, the kind that lives in your pulse. From the porch, Harlan watched her. He didn't call out, didn't walk down. He knew she wasn't alone. She never had been. Daniel stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes distant. He said nothing either. There was no need to fill this space. They both understood. Some things were only meant to be felt. The camera pulls back, wide. The trees lean toward each other in the breeze, whispering old songs. The path behind Bella stretches in either direction, marked by footsteps, stories, soil. The light catches on her face, her hand still on the wood. And then, faint, distant, unmistakable, the sound of hooves, soft, becoming rhythm, becoming a heartbeat, becoming breath, and finally, becoming silence. But not absence, just stillness, the kind that listens and remembers. Fade to black,